Setting a strong, unique tone is important for any video game, especially if it's open world. There are simply so many open world games out there these days that the best of them need to find ways to stand out right from the beginning. Elden Ring does this with the Chapel of Anticipation, where newcomers and veterans are reminded that, no matter who wrote the lore, this is still a From Software game, and you should still prepare to die. Skyrim, as old as it might be at this point, continues to stand out thanks to its flexibility of player choice and its smooth introduction to both the Stormcloak Rebellion and the threat of Alduin. The Witcher 3 sets tone in a variety of ways, which is necessary thanks to the sheer scope and size of its open world. Its biomes, White Orchard, Novigrad, and of course Velen, are small games in their own right, and thus require their own individual salvos of tone setting. In White Orchard, it's the opening quest with the Griffin, which, as I've said elsewhere, teaches the player what it means to be a Witcher. For Novigrad, it's the oppression of mutants, the horrible violence inflicted on mages and Dopplers, which reminds us that even on the continent, humankind will target the other during times of peril. And in Velen, there's no better tone setter than the Crones of Crookback Bog. Among the most disturbing creatures Geralt can encounter on his journey, the Crones embody the open hostility of war-torn Velen and hint toward the hidden horrors of the continent, a feat they accomplish through a brilliant mix of environmental and direct storytelling. In doing so, they serve as the foremost example of the way the Witcher universe adapts fairy tales in the darkest way possible, and remind the player that Geralt is far from the most powerful person in the game. And when it's all said and done, and the credits roll on The Witcher 3, the Crones stand out as the game's signature villains. But before I go on, if you are a Witcher fan, then please be sure to like, subscribe, and consider supporting me with a YouTube channel membership or over on Patreon. My dream is to make these videos full-time someday, and by doing any of those things, you'll be helping make that dream a reality. If you're paying close attention, then you'll hear about the Crones long before you actually meet them. Visit just about any village in Velen, walk around for a minute or so, and you'll eventually hear about how unwanted children are sent down the Trail of Treats. As the player will soon learn, this is the path one must take to find their way to Crookback Bog, the domain of the Three Ladies of the Wood. There, the Crones do take care of the abandoned children, but only so they can fatten them up and eat them later. It is as horrible as it sounds, and it's a perfect example of how The Witcher adapts fairy tales to their dark fantasy setting. We've all heard the story of Hansel and Gretel, how a pair of siblings were cast out into the woods by their parents and ran afoul of a witch who tried to eat them. The motivations of the Crones take clear inspiration from that tale, and in doing so, show us how the developers intend to take the legends we're familiar with and present them in the grimmest way they can. But what's particularly interesting to me about the Crones and their orphan stew isn't how gruesome or disturbing it is, but the reason so many children end up abandoned in the first place. In most versions of the story, Hansel and Gretel are cast out because they were naughty little children who wouldn't behave for their parents. This is part of the reason they're fairy tales in the first place. Fairy tales are supposed to have a moral message, to be instructive to some degree. At its roots, Hansel and Gretel tells kids that they'd better be good for their parents because their lives could be so much worse. The idea that their parents got rid of them because they were misbehaving or simply unwanted isn't realistic. And it doesn't have to be, because it's a fairy tale. But again, The Witcher isn't just aiming to restate fairy tales, but to adapt them to their dark fantasy setting. And when it comes to the problems of everyday folks, dark fantasy tends to try and keep it real. Supernatural beings can have supernatural motivations, but your average farmer needs to have desires that are more grounded. So while the motivations of the Crones themselves align with their fairy tale counterparts, a dynamic that only heightens their terrifying behavior, the same can't be true of the parents sending their children off to be eaten. They can't just be abandoning them because they didn't pick up their toys or woke up one day and decided they didn't want them around anymore. That's simply not realistic. Their actions, as unforgivable as they are, need to be rooted in something, or we're not truly dealing with dark fantasy. If you go back and listen to the conversations the villagers of Velen have about sending their kids down the Trail of Treats, they'll come right out and admit why they're doing it. They're abandoning their kids because they're poor as fuck. They'll say that they have too many mouths to feed, that there's not enough food to go around, or space in their homes. Again, in no way does it make their actions justifiable. The villagers might not know what happens to the children once they reach Crookback Bog, but they have to know that they're never seen or heard from again, so there's no way they've deluded themselves into believing that they're living large out there in the swamps, dining on sweets for every meal, and being cared for by a staff of godling butlers. They know that the Crones are doing something horrible to the children, but they're driven to send them down the Trail of Treats anyway because the economic situation in Velen is that bad. It remains unforgivable, but it does ground their actions in a real-world difficulty. It helps set the tone for Velen, for the war-torn hellscape the Third Northern War has reduced it to. It lets Geralt and the player know that wherever he goes, he'll be dealing with sad, broken families who don't have two florins to rub together and are so desperate for economic relief that they'd happily send their children to the Crones just to lighten the load. Like Westeros in George R. R. Martin's A Feast for Crows, it establishes Velen as a medieval world reeling from the horrors of conflict. And when it comes to this particular injustice, it's the vile ladies of the wood who are benefiting the most. But there's another piece that cuts into all this, that sheds serious light on the larger role the Crones play here in Velen. Circling back to those overheard conversations once more, something some of the awful parents say to justify their actions is that they feel that they can always just have another kid. This accomplishes two things. First, it's a reminder that in a medieval world, kids were often viewed as another set of helping hands rather than a living, breathing person who needed to be cared for. We all had that friend growing up who couldn't hang out on the weekends because they needed to help their parents around the house. This is that type of thing on steroids. But more than that, it shows that the people of Velen are, essentially, using the Crones as a form of population control. It's easy to forget, but unless these villagers have a sorceress on speed dial, they have no access to contraceptives. But people are people, and if the ruins of Pompeii are any indication, then there's nothing better for a libido than the end of the world. So, to put it succinctly, the people of Velen are content to keep having children, because they know that if they fall on hard times, they can always send them down the Trail of Treats, reap the benefits of a lighter economic load, and then just have another one when they're in a more stable situation. It's bleak, gross, and establishes Velen as probably the single most depressing, grimdark biome in the history of open-world video games. Thus, with the Crones filling this macabre role, it's not hard to see why some of the villagers view them as a positive force in the region. They aren't the ones getting turned into soup. That gruesome fate is reserved for the children they couldn't afford to keep around. Understanding this, that some of Velen's populace readily accepts the Crones because they do help them, even if it's in the darkest way possible, is important, because it's going to inform so much of what happens down the line. But all of that is environmental storytelling, the things you have to go looking for to find out. For most players, the first time they'll learn about the Trail of Treats is during the Bloody Baron's quest, where they'll meet Gretka. Abandoned by her father, she'll give a face to the many children sent to the Crones over the years. Fortunately for her, she was rescued by Ciri before she could reach Crookback Bog. When it comes time to go there ourselves, she's one of several sources who can point the way. Alternatively, the player can read about them in one of the books in Avalok's lab, which conveys much of the information I've already covered, along with our first mention of their mother, a character who will become very important later on. By journeying to Crookback Bog, Geralt is hoping to find out information on Ciri's whereabouts. He knows she quarreled with a witch, and after ruling out Kira Metz as a potential suspect, his search leads him to the Crones. This sets him up as a foil to the many parents who sent their kids down the Trail of Treats. Rather than ushering an unwanted child to their doom down a path laden with sweets, he's navigating this grim rendition of Hershey's Chocolate World Tour in the hopes of rescuing his adopted daughter, a girl who's brought him far more trouble than the villagers of Velen could ever imagine. The game is full of contrasts like this, where Geralt, the supposedly emotionless Witcher, who, to the uninitiated, would seem like the furthest thing from a capable father, repeatedly shows how great of a parent he is when compared to average humans. And this is yet another example. The arrival at Crookback Bog is harrowing and sets the stage for a theme that will carry over to just about every one of our interactions with the Crones. How the developers set you up to feel really, really uncomfortable. Here, the Orphans do their best "I see dead people" routine by singing a horrifying nursery rhyme. It's legitimately creepy and puts Geralt and the player on edge right away. Talking with the Orphans yields little information, but will trigger an appearance by Gran. Aside from their weird song, we don't see how much danger the kids are in just yet. In contrast to just about every other person we meet in Velen, they are, at least, having some fun when we first meet them. Gran, on the other hand, hints towards the danger of the Crones. She is so clearly delirious, shifting between references to her actual family, her past, and the Orphans, that trying to get information out of her is a truly heartbreaking experience. Unable to get a clear answer from Gran about Ciri, Geralt tries to ask one of the Orphans, a boy named Traffic, who mentioned that Johnny the Godling might know something, for more information. But Gran's not having any of that. As delusional as she is, she knows that the children are in danger, but is unsure of who's the biggest threat to them, and thus is determined to keep everyone, even someone who could potentially help them, like Geralt, away. To get Gran away from Traffic, Geralt is forced to play hide and seek with the Orphans. It's easily one of my favorite segments in The Witcher 3. Not only is it fun from a gameplay perspective, but it drives home Geralt's talent for working with children. Seriously, everything he does here, from taking a knee so he can speak to them at their level, to using a calm but kind tone of voice, and comforting them when they start to talk about their trauma, is exactly what you're supposed to do in this situation. In another life, Geralt probably would have made a pretty good teacher. As thanks for playing their game, the Orphans distract Gran, giving Geralt an opening to talk to Traffic. During this conversation, while sharing the circumstances that led to his arrival at Crookback Bog, Traffic mentions that his parents, and those of the other children, were all either murdered or starved. Again, we have plenty of evidence, both from overheard conversations and the story of Gretka, that confirm that plenty of kids are deliberately sent down the trail of treats by their parents. But for these children, the situation is different. Murder and starvation are clear side effects of the Third Northern War, the terribly natural consequences of the ongoing conflict between Redania and Nilfgaard. Once again, we see the Crones and everything around them setting the tone for not only the region, but the game as well. Traffic reveals Johnny's location, and off the White Wolf goes into the swamp, looking for the Godling. Johnny, by the way, is one of my favorite characters in the entire game, and will certainly be getting his own video at some point. But for now, let's stick to where his story intersects with the Crones. In yet another fantastic scene, Geralt talks with the temporarily mute Johnny, and helps him get his voice back. In the conversation that follows, Johnny explains that it was the Crones who stole his voice, which really speaks to the vast power they wield. The very nature of how they pulled it off confuses Geralt, which says a lot. The White Wolf's seen just about everything, and yet he asks Johnny how it's even possible to bottle up someone's voice. Johnny also reiterates what I said earlier about how the Crones care for Velen and its people in their own twisted way. Folk just need to be careful what they ask for, lest they end up on the receiving end of a terrible deal, a line that foreshadows Gran's unfortunate fate. But critically, he confirms that Ciri did land in the area around Crookback Bog, and that the Crones were after her. Together, Johnny and Geralt head back to Gran. As thanks for restoring his voice, Johnny intercedes on the White Wolf's behalf. He sings to her, which seems to, albeit temporarily, wash away her madness. She's still hesitant to help Geralt, another hint towards the Crones' power over her, but she agrees to contact them as thanks for all the times Johnny helped the orphans and took nothing in return. Despite her earlier insistence that the godling didn't exist at all, she does like the lad, as she'll admit to Geralt. But he's run afoul of the Crones, and if she's going to protect the children from them, which seems to be her priority even when she's delirious, then she needs to steer clear of Johnny. Fortunately for Geralt, Johnny's past aid is enough for Gran to look the other way for the time being. They then enter the largest dwelling in the bog, where Gran puts her hand to an enchanted tapestry, allowing the Crones to speak through her. After chastising Anna, the Crones turn their attention to Geralt. Speaking in turns, they make multiple passes at him throughout this conversation. Again, it's more tone-setting on the part of the ladies. Our every encounter with them is dripping with sexuality. Whether it's their sultry appearance on the tapestry itself, or the way they ask Geralt to touch them. These Crones are really horny, and it is really weird. This, coupled with the fact that there are 3 of them, align them with the witches from Macbeth. It's a great cultural reference point, as the Scottish play, as actors call it, is among the 3 Shakespearean works most folks read while they're in high school. To anyone familiar with the words double, double, toil and trouble, it's a reminder, on top of everything else we've already seen, that the Crones are not to be reckoned with. After Geralt's had enough of their attempts to get in his trousers, the White Wolf takes a more direct approach, asking them what became of Ciri. They agree to tell him, but only if he takes care of a dark power that has surfaced near Down Warren. Geralt tries to turn them down, suggesting they find a noble knight to take care of the matter, but at this point, he really doesn't have much of a choice. If he wants to find out what happened to Ciri while she was in Velen, then he needs to work for the Crones, the most powerful and dangerous group of creatures he's come across in the game. Noticeably, even though he's backed into a corner, Geralt tells the Crones that he can't make any promises. I have no doubt that this is because he's well aware that what they're asking of him might be something that he will ultimately have to refuse to do. Regardless, the Crones hand Geralt a dagger, saying that Down Warren's Elderman will know what to do with it. Before Geralt leaves, there are a couple of interesting items he can find inside the Crones' hut. 2 books, one on witchers and another on vampires. CD Projekt Red usually places books where it's most convenient for them to be, where the information will be most beneficial to the player, like all of the texts summing up the state of the Third Northern War in Yennefer's room in Vizima. But this questline doesn't tell us anything about witchers that we don't already know, and I don't think the Crones are Twilight fans, so why are these books here? Well, CD Projekt Red certainly isn't From Software in terms of the level of implication it applies to item descriptions, but given the amount of environmental storytelling around the Crones, it wouldn't shock me if this indicates that they've been looking for someone of significant power, in this case a witcher or a vampire, to deal with this dark power for some time. With dagger in hand, Geralt leaves the bog and travels to Down Warren, where he meets with the Elderman. Hilariously, the White Wolf opens the conversation by drawing attention to how much of a shithole the village is, calling it a real pearl of the swamps. And he's right. There are some serious dives in Velen, but Down Warren is at the top of the list. In any case, the Elderman tells Geralt about what's been happening to the villagers. He claims that the war woke up something beneath the Whispering Hillock, and ever since, crops have failed to grow, and people have sleepwalked out of their homes and towards the ancient tree, never to return. The ground beneath the hillock, he claims, is white with human bone. It's pretty harrowing stuff, and enough to make it clear that the Crones weren't exaggerating when they called whatever is behind all this a dark power. We'll get more into my take on all that later, but regardless, it's worth noting that, at this point, the Crones do appear to be living up to their reputation. As evil as they are, they do care for Velen, albeit in their own twisted way. But as Geralt will soon learn, it's not just the region that will benefit from the removal of this dark power, but the 3 ladies themselves. If the player hasn't yet figured out that the Crones weren't bluffing, they'll realize it when they reach the Whispering Hillock. This whole area is such a fantastic example of environmental game design. The way the sky darkens as Geralt arrives, the sound of the wind whipping him around, and the disturbing moaning beneath the earth all make it very clear that something wicked this way comes. The voice calls out to the White Wolf, warning him not to come closer, and saying that powers in the area protect her. After fighting through some wolves and a werewolf, and discovering plenty of bodies along the way, Geralt will eventually find a cave that leads beneath the Whispering Hillock. There, he will meet the spirit in the tree. In the conversation that follows, the spirit will claim that the Crones killed her body long ago, and trapped her spirit here. She'll say that the Crones wanted to rule over Velen alone, and because she stood in their way, she had to die. If Geralt presses her for more information, she'll expand on the vile nature of the Crones, saying that they hear all thanks to a collection of sacrificed human ears, and died on human flesh to maintain their strength. As for all of the corpses Geralt found on his way here, the spirit will be dismissive of them, saying that in the eyes of nature, all death is alike and equal, which I must say is a rather Dr. Manhattan-esque thing to say. Thus, the Crones, she insists, are the real villains of Velen, not her, not the spirit who's been causing the people of Down Warren to sleepwalk their way towards her and killing anything that dares approach the hillock. This is, all in all, a classic setup for the decision to come. In so many quests in The Witcher 3, Geralt finds himself at the center of a decision where there's no right or wrong, where both parties have done terrible things, and he's forced to choose the lesser evil. Drunkards and blacksmiths, a clueless man, and his vengeful former lover. Here, it's happening on a much larger, more dangerous scale, as Geralt is forced to take a side in an ancient battle between some of the most powerful entities he's ever encountered. At the end of their conversation, the White Wolf is faced with a choice. He can either free the spirit in the tree, in which case he'll need to round up a horse for her to possess, or do what the Crones sent him to do, and kill her. Were it not for what happens next, I'd wager that this decision would be an easy one for most players. If both the Crones and the spirit in the tree are evil, then why not kill the spirit now and hope to get the same opportunity with the three ladies down the road? But before he can weigh either of these options, the spirit throws in a complicating factor: the fate of the orphans. She claims that the orphans are in danger, that they've been taken to Ard Carabin, and that only she can save them. It's worth noting that Ard Carabin is Bald Mountain, where Ciri and Geralt will ultimately confront the Crones at the end of the game. As we see in that quest, the White Wolf and his ashen-haired daughter have to go through quite the ordeal to get an audience with the three ladies in the first place, so the spirit in the tree is probably correct that she alone has the power to rescue the orphans. We'll take a further look at the decision itself in a minute, but first, let's consider what other information is available to us about the Crones and this mysterious spirit. Adding to my speculation that the books on witchers and vampires in the Crones' dwelling might have been placed there intentionally is the fact that our best secondhand source of information about these characters comes from yet another in-game text. If the player reads She Who Knows, they'll learn that the spirit is actually the mother of the Crones, who came to Velen from a foreign land. After creating her three daughters from dirt and water, she ruled over the province, much as the Crones do in the game, even accepting sacrifices from her people on her, quote, special night, which is probably the annual Sabbath up on Bald Mountain. Over time, however, the spirit went mad, and as she declined, so too did Velen, to the point where the land was, quote, drowning in blood. Thus, the Crones were forced to kill her, and trap her soul, which refused to leave, in the Whispering Hillock. This paints the Crones in a more positive light, as not some meddlesome, power-hungry, bitchy witches, as the spirit puts it, but instead a trio of daughters who were forced to put down the sad old woman their mother had become. We don't know who wrote this book, but considering it's from a pro-Crone source, it's probably the work of someone in Velen, someone the Crones no doubt approved of. So I obviously don't think we should just take the text at face value. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a grain of truth here. Perhaps, when you look past the pro-Crone propaganda, the bones of this tale might be true. Personally, I think it's likely that the mother of the Crones did fall to madness, and that they were forced to kill her. This aligns with much of what we see from them in-game. Again, As depraved as they are, they do care about Velen, and send Geralt to take care of the spirit when its effect on the people of Down Warren gets out of control. So maybe they did rally together to kill their mother when madness overtook her. But I suspect that that's where the truth of this story ends. Because now, hundreds of years later, it's quite clear that the Crones have become the very thing they once sought to destroy, and are just as mad as the mother they interred inside the Whispering Hillock. Perhaps the appearance of the Crones in the tapestry, and as we see them later on inside Bald Mountain, is not an illusion, as we've long been led to believe, but how they looked before they dove headfirst into the depths of depravity. It's just speculation, but I rather like this theory. It paints the land of Velen as a place not unlike Lordran and Dark Souls, where those who link the fire, like Gwyn, eventually go hollow and need to be replaced. The Crones killed their mother and trapped her spirit when this happened to her, and now someone needs to do the same to them. But back to the quest. This becomes the biggest decision Geralt has faced so far. Should he free the spirit, a clearly mad, evil entity, so she can rescue the orphans? Or should he rid Velen of the spirit for good, but allow the orphans to be devoured by the Crones? As I've said elsewhere, there's no winning in The Witcher. No matter how you proceed, you're likely to be pleased with part of what you did, grateful that your decision did benefit some people, but full of regret for those caught in the crossfire. Once again, by sending Geralt down this path, the Crones are setting the tone of the game. Earlier, it was by illustrating just how bleak a place Velen is. Now, they're reminding the player that the most significant choices they'll make on the path will be morally gray, where someone always loses, and where you'll often be left wondering if you really did the right thing. Whether you kill the spirit or free it, you'll have to return to the Elderman, who will cut off his ear with the dagger the Crones gave to Geralt. The ear is his payment to the Crones for a job well done. In turn, the Crones will use it to pull a Patriot Act and listen in on Velen, just as the spirit claimed. With the bloody ear, Geralt returns to Crookback Bog, where he will, finally, meet the Crones in the flesh. Their arrival has to be one of the most iconic moments in the entire game. The intensity of the music, the fog drifting from the tapestry, and the reveal of their true appearance. It's some legit horror movie stuff. After they comment on what you decided to do with the spirit in the tree, either by forgiving Gran if you killed it, or blaming her if you freed it, Geralt will realize that Gran is really Anna, the wife of the Bloody Baron. In response, the Crones will tell the White Wolf that she came to them because she was pregnant, seeking what we can only describe as an abortion. Now, our earlier discussion about how the people of Velen used the Crones as a form of birth control comes full circle to the forefront of the game in a far more literal application of the term. Previously, they were going about this in the darkest way possible, sending fully alive, unwanted children down the trail of treats. Here, it's a story that hits closer to home. A woman pregnant with a fetus she does not want receiving an abortion from the only people, in this case, the dangerous Crones who can provide her with one. They did as Anna asked, but not without triggering it at a moment that drives the Baron further into his own misery. And in return, Anna is sapped of her strength and forced to work for the Crones. I have a lot to say about all this, especially in light of recent events here in the United States. But all of that will have to wait for a future video, in which I intend to give Anna's story the voice it deserves. This is yet another example of the Crones helping the people of Velen, but in a macabre, manipulative way. From there, Geralt can ask them more questions if he'd like, all of which they respond to with plenty of innuendos, again reinforcing their tradition of making everything uncomfortably sexual, as I mentioned earlier. But eventually, the White Wolf will get around to the topic he came here for, information on Ciri. Women of their word, or so they claim, the Crones will reveal that Ciri landed in the bog, at which point they brought her back to their home. There, as the player might have guessed by this point, the Crones had every intention of eating her, or at least sampling some of her elder blood, before planning to turn her over to the Wild Hunt. Ciri, fortunately, escaped their clutches, fighting past hounds of the hunt until she encountered Gretka. It's interesting to note that during this sequence, Ciri can kill the Crones if the player so desires. but doing so results in a game over, as it would obviously create a time paradox. The White Wolf can't ask the Crones where Ciri is if they're dead. Once the Crones have finished their story, Geralt, as you might expect, flips out on the three ladies, vowing to come back and kill them no matter what dialogue option you choose. This is one of those moments where we see the father in the White Wolf really come out front and center. Later, when the topic of the Crones comes up with the Baron, Geralt makes it very clear that he thinks that going back to Crookback Bog is a terrible idea. If not for his love for Ciri, and his desire to bring his parental vengeance down on anyone who would dare harm her, he'd probably have just walked away from Velen and done his best not to think of the Crones ever again. So, in this instance, he threatens them, and they do the same in return, taunting Geralt by saying that Ciri will continue to be a mirage in his search for her, eluding him at every turn, and that she'll be dead by the time he finds her. All of this is, in some ways, accurate. The classic half-truths of prophecy, as is their prediction that he will, indeed, someday face them in battle. Our next encounter with the Crones is this long-awaited confrontation, but first, Geralt will need to return to Crookback Bog with the Bloody Baron to conclude the award-winning Family Matters questline. I discussed this at length in my video on the Baron, so I won't rehash it much here, other than to say that no matter what happens at the conclusion of this quest, whether Anna lives but is stricken with madness, is turned into a water hag, or dies in a burst of fire, it's a reminder of just how powerful the Crones are, and that coming out on top of any encounter with them is highly unlikely. This, of course, is a gruesome truth that weighs heavily over our climactic standoff with the three ladies. Countless hours later, after the Battle of Kaer Morhen, Ciri will wake up Geralt and ask to travel to Velen. She's learned that the annual Sabbath is set to take place up on Bald Mountain, and that Imlerith will be the guest of honor. She asks Geralt to journey there with her, to exact vengeance on both the Crones and the bastard who took Vesemir's life. So together, the White Wolf and his adopted daughter go on a revenge tour with 4 powerful supernatural entities in their sights. It's important to note that even here, the Crones are contributing to more tone setting, in this case, the third and final act of the game. Up to this point, The Witcher 3 has been about Geralt trying to find Ciri and protect her from the Wild Hunt. But as the game winds to a close, the focus shifts on how he can help Ciri grow into the person she's supposed to be, how he can transform from a father who supports his adopted daughter instead of parents her. Allowing Ciri to decide their next course of action after Vesemir's death is our first example of this. And it's the Crones and their tone-setting ways that give her the opportunity for the retribution she desires. What we learn on Bald Mountain reinforces so much of what we already know about the Crones, that the people of Velen view them positively despite all the evidence to the contrary because of the few things they have done to help the province. One of the things the Elder we can speak to brings up specifically is the acorns they provide to them. These acorns come from the tree at the top of the mountain, which, according to the ever-helpful book She Who Knows, was watered with the blood of the Crone's mother, the spirit in the tree. So in all likelihood, these acorns do indeed have supernatural powers, which of course makes them all the more valuable to the people of Velen. With how terrible their lives are, with how impoverished and downtrodden the province is, of course they'd be more than willing to prostrate themselves before a trio of crazy witches in return for a gift that will allow them to have a richer harvest or a cure for consumption. All of this speaks to the stranglehold the Crones have on the region. The people of Velen tolerate their evil ways and their depravity and care not for what they do to their children because there is no one else to look out for them. Nilfgaard doesn't care about them as much of a backwater as they are, and it seems that even before the fall of Temeria, Foltest and his ancestors didn't either. Devoid of any true authority figures, they've turned to the vile ladies and gladly ignore their tyranny in exchange for the little help they do give them. Before I move on, there are 2 details from this conversation that I think are worthy of a closer look. First, according to the Elder, the 3 young people sent to the Crones on the Sabbath always return, but don't stay in Velen for long, instead venturing off to seek fortunes in lands afar. But as we see later on, the Crones turned these unfortunate young people into bloody soup. So I'd wager that the young people who return from their encounter with the Crones are actually illusions created by the three ladies. It would also explain why they typically leave Velen shortly thereafter. That's just their way of keeping up the ruse, of ending the illusion before anyone catches on to what really happened. This, in turn, would help keep up their benevolent appearance, something that seems to be rather important to them. Next, it's also of interest to me that the Elder claims that the Crones did at one point come down from the mountain to listen to grievances from the villagers. It's unclear when this happened, however. The Elder says that his father told him about it, but he doesn't clarify whether or not he saw it firsthand. It might have been a story his father heard from his own father, who in turn heard it from someone else. Geralt even comments on this, saying that it's probably been a long time since they took such a direct interest in the needs of the villagers. Personally, I think this strengthens my theory that the Crones became more like their mother as the years went by. I wouldn't be surprised if this story comes from the very first Sabbath, when the Crones wanted to keep up the appearance of being better than their predecessor. But now, hundreds of years later, their brutal rule is just as bloody as her own. After passing a few trials that allow them to circumvent the plans of the Crones, which, again, call for just 3 people to ascend Bald Mountain, Geralt and Ciri head straight into the lair of the ladies. With both the 3 witches and Imlerith on their kill list, they decide to divide and conquer to ensure that none of their enemies leave the Sabbath alive. Determined to avenge Vesemir, Ciri wants to take on Imlerith, but Geralt insists on her facing the Crones. They end up playing rock, paper, scissors over it, which stands out as one of the more charming moments of the game. Geralt wins, and they end up doing things his way. But it's always been of interest to me that he wanted Ciri to fight the ladies in the first place. Because if you ask me, the Crones are a far more formidable opponent than Imlerith. At this point, Geralt has seen the gigantic leader of the Wild Hunt fight once already, and knows what to expect. He's going to tank damage with his nearly impenetrable armor, dish out big hits with his massive mace, and toss in a few spells here and there. The Crones, on the other hand, are a complete wild card. He knows they're powerful, but he's never seen them in battle, and knows nothing about the litany of spells they surely have at their disposal. And to make matters worse, there are 3 of them. So why then does Geralt send Ciri off to fight the stronger, more unpredictable opponent? Well, I might be reading too much into this, but I think he does it for 2 reasons. First, Ciri just matches up better with the Crones. Her magic and her ability to blink around the battlefield will allow her to control the crowd and better evade their spells, while he has a better chance at getting through Imlerith's armor thanks to his superior swordsmanship and access to bombs. Plus, Ciri's younger than he is, and at this point in her life is far more prone to giving into her emotions than Geralt is. Thus, he's probably concerned that face to face with the man who killed Vesemir, she might react recklessly and charge into the fight without a clear head. And as The Witcher shows us time and time again, winning a fight is often more about having the proper mindset and the right strategy than just pure reflexes. Regardless of his reasoning, the ensuing boss battle allows the Crones to set the tone for a final time. We played as Ciri in bits and pieces throughout the game, with limited access to her abilities, her full potential only hinted at. But here, in the lair of the ladies, the lion cub of Sintra is fully unleashed. Now, not only can she blink away from danger, but charge through the Crones and appear beside them to deliver devastating surprise attacks. More than any other segment of the game, this one defines Ciri as a badass, which is incredibly important for the rest of the game, because Ciri and her growth is about to take center stage. So even in death, even as Geralt's adopted daughter is chopping them to pieces, the Crones are establishing the tone of The Witcher 3. One of the Crones, Weavis, does survive the encounter, absconding with Vesemir's medallion, which Ciri had taken off of his funeral pyre. This matter doesn't come up again in the base game, and is only addressed in the bad ending, where Geralt tracks down Weavis, kills her, and then accepts his death in the swamps as monsters surround him. It's a harrowing conclusion, and I sure am glad it's a sequence I've only ever seen for research purposes. Because if I got that ending my first time around, then damn, I don't know if I could have lived with myself. Still, even here, in the most depressing conclusion to Geralt's journey, Weavis is continuing the tradition of the Crones and setting the bleak, defeated tone. It's as grim as chasing down the last memento of your beloved daughter would be, and it's Weavis that allows the developers to tell this gut-wrenching story. With the Crones dead, or at least reduced in number, the question is, what becomes of Velen? After defeating Imlerith, the two villagers from earlier will approach Geralt and Ciri, lamenting the death of the great oak at the top of Bald Mountain. It seems that with the defeat of the Crones, or perhaps simply the failure of their Sabbath ritual, the powerful tree has met its end, leaving behind only a single acorn. Geralt can loot it from Imlerith's body, which is a pretty easy thing to miss, because you don't get the opportunity to do so right after defeating him. The game thrusts you right into the White Wolf's mission debrief with his ashen-haired daughter. You can go back to get it later, but if you want to get it right away, you'll have to tell Ciri that you'd like to stick around on Bald Mountain for a bit at the end of your conversation with her. The acorn can be used to grant Geralt 2 free ability points, but if you're feeling generous and have it in your inventory when you meet the villagers, you can offer it to them as a parting gift. Regardless of what you choose to do with the last remnant of the great oak, Geralt will tell the villagers that it's time for them to make Velen their own. It's no longer ruled over by the Crones, nor their mother. It belongs to them. This is a wonderful sentiment, and one I wish I could subscribe to. But after hundreds of years of being ruled and manipulated by a supernatural being, and thanks to their position on the map, right in the middle of several powerful countries, I find the idea that the people of Velen will be able to successfully rule the land on their own to be pretty hard to believe. Unfortunately, I find it far more likely that they'll end up being caught under the boot of someone else's tyrannical rule, either a local leader who rules over the province with an iron fist, or a new supernatural entity who attempts to fill the power vacuum left behind by the Crones. Whether it's at the beginning of our journey in Velen, where they help establish the bleak, war-torn, and beleaguered nature of the province, the events of Crookback Bog, where they remind us that there's no winning in The Witcher, and that there are forces in this world with power greater than Geralt could ever imagine, or at the end, where they put Ciri over as a top-notch ass-kicker, the Crones are consistently setting the tone of The Witcher 3. In turn, this feeds into their identity as the game's signature villains. No one else from the game's cast allows the developers to cover such varied ground, to consistently reset the table and deliver their intended message as much as the Crones. At the same time, thanks to their nature and obvious influences from the Three Witches of Macbeth to the story of Hansel and Gretel, they exemplify the unique, folkloric brand of dark fantasy we've come to expect from our journeys on the continent. And that is what makes the Crones so important to The Witcher 3. I play a lot of video games, and I intend to continue to do so until my hands are too withered to pick up a controller. But I don't think I'll ever forget about the disturbing ladies of the wood. It will be really interesting to see what CD Projekt Red does with Velen in The Witcher 4. Personally, I hope they take us back there. I think the land still has plenty of stories left to tell, and as much as the Crones are their signature villain, Velen might just be their signature region. So far on this channel, we've covered several big-name characters from The Witcher 3, including Emir and the Bloody Baron. But it's about time we discuss one of the game's most overlooked figures. So I hope you'll join me next time as we take a deep dive into Geralt's greatest roadblock, Eredin, King of the Wild Hunt. Thank you for watching what is now my longest video essay on YouTube, topping my previous video on the Bloody Baron by over 10 minutes. I guess I shouldn't be surprised that my coverage of The Witcher 3 is resulting in such long videos. It is, after all, a really long game. huge thank you to all the musicians who contributed songs to this epic essay. If you're still watching this video, then you probably know that I usually use Ellen Storm for my Witcher content, who does appear here with her cover of Kaer Morhen and her mashup of that theme and Ezio's family from Assassin's Creed. But because this video was so much longer than my other ones, I decided to pull together a larger team of musicians, a Witcher Avengers, if you will, to help me out with this one. The other members of this team include Vintek, who provided his cover of Ladies of the Wood, Sheonader Pazik for his rendition of Geralt of Rivia's theme on Hurdy-Gurdy, and Farewellian for her version of Vagabond. You can check out more incredible music from all 4 of these super talented artists by following the link below to their channel pages. And of course, huge shout out to all my silver and gold tier channel members and Patreon subscribers, including James Pruitt, Braven Lampkin, Corey Matson, Gustavo Balabi, Little Caesar, Reed, and Pathonian, who get early access to these videos thanks to donations of $5 to $10 a month. See you guys next time!